Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, March 2nd, 1971, a bomb was set off on the ground floor of the U.S. Capitol, causing extensive damage and opening what Capitol Police Chief James Powell said appeared to be a, quote, serious crack in the already weakened west front of the building. The bombing actually took place on March 1st, I should clarify, but we're doing this episode on March 2nd. Now, the bombing, we would come to learn, was the work of the Weather Underground, the leftist militant group that came out of the nonviolent protest movements of the 60s. The group got its name from a Bob Dylan lyric, "You don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows." They originally called the Weathermen, and then they changed their name to the Weather Underground. So let's talk about the bombing at the Capitol, this era of political violence in the early 70s, and maybe we can get into a little compare and contrast between leftist political tactics of the 70s and leftist political tactics of today. So lots to talk about, and here, as always, is Nicole Hemmer of Columbia. Hello, Niki.
Hey, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello, Kellie.
Hey there.
So let's start with the bombing itself. Kellie, you want to paint the scene of what went down on March 1st, 1971?
Yes, sure. So fortunately, there are no deaths and there are no injuries with this explosion. It took place on the Senate side of the building in an unmarked men's washroom. And it happens about 1:30 in the morning. And interestingly enough, they're actually tipped off. You know, guards are given a call about less than an hour before the bombing actually happens to warn them. Thankfully, because it also happened at 1:30 in the morning, the building is not filled with people or senator or congressman at the time. But when the explosion happens, it's a pretty big deal. And the WO, or the Weather Underground organization, took credit for the bombing, said that it was in retaliation for the U.S. bombing and raid in Hanoi. And this really sparks, a number of violent incidences that are happening all throughout this period related to the war, unrest, waves against capitalism and socialism and things of that nature.
You can see how this would be pretty unsettling for senators, even though it happened at this early hour in the morning when there aren't people around. But this really is part of the social space where senators work. It's their washroom. It's an unmarked one that's usually used by the senators. It's next to their barber shop. Back in the day, they could get their hair cut while they were senating. And yet at the same time, I think it's a really important point that this was a bombing that was aimed at sending a message rather than injuring people or killing people. And this was true of a lot of this kind of terroristic violence in the 1970s, that it really was about the terror rather than the killing. And you would get, this was true for IRA bombings in Britain, although not exclusively, they often would call ahead of time and give people a heads up and some warning to show that they could hurt people if they wanted to, but they weren't going to do it in this case.
Yeah. And what was your sense of the reaction in the moment to this bombing? Was the message sent in the way that you think it was intended?
I think that people were discomfited. There was a sense that there was growing restlessness and violence. And of course, this is coming off the back of the 1960s, where there had been all these political assassinations. There was foreign terrorism that was happening at the same time, plane hijackings. And so I think that it fed into this broader sense of instability. And yet, at the same time, I mean, you listen to the news reports and they're not exactly tearing their hair out over this. There is a kind of almost ironicness to the way that they talk about what's happening, in part, I guess, because it doesn't cause so much damage and it certainly doesn't cause death. And so there's a little bit of emotional distance from the terror.
Yeah.
Yeah, because no one is harmed. It gets minimalized, I think, in a lot of ways. But I think had the destruction even been bigger, not just the loss of lives or injuries, but the destruction been bigger, it also might have caused more of a response or greater response.
Yeah. But there's a lesson here, I think, of how violence can get normalized. And certainly, I think, remembering that in this era, as you were alluding to, Niki, I mean, you know, there's a great book about hijackings, plane jackings that are in this era. And it's like planes were getting hijacked like all the time.
All the time.
And bombs were going off, fairly often. And so, political assassinations, I think, are in a different class. But this sort of like quote unquote routine violence or drumbeat of violence, you do get normalized to it. And I think and it's important to remember that there was an era in American history where that was the case. And not just this era. And Kellie, I mean, you think about these eras all the time. And so I wonder if you have thoughts comparing this era to other eras of where just political violence is just in the air.
Well, I mean, there's barely a decade that ever passes American history where there's not intense amounts of political violence. For me, in particular, the 1850s, you have these violent skirmishes that are happening all throughout the antebellum period. But even if we were to point to recent memory, in the past several years, we've had mass shootings, almost one a week or one every 2 weeks. And there was a numbness that came with those mass shootings as well.
Yeah, and I think that the other context of violence for this conversation is the Vietnam War. I mean, we tend to separate out state-sanctioned violence when we're talking about political violence, but part of the argument that the Weather Underground was making was that they were bringing the war home. That just as the U.S. was exercising this intense amount of violence abroad, that what they were going to do is they were going to turn that violence inward on the United States, and in this case, foment a violent revolution. But there is this way that state violence refracts across a society and leads to more types of violence, whether it's police violence, whether it's military violence. I mean, those things have an effect, and I think the context of the Vietnam War is important to understanding why there's so much instability and why there's a turn to even more violence in this period.
Sure. And I mean, the Weather Underground, very explicitly was an anti-war effort that then started to align itself with other efforts at home. But the Vietnam War was the organizing principle around that group. So let's talk a little bit more about that group. And Kellie, you alluded to it a little bit, but the shift from the 60s into the 70s, the different kinds of anti-war efforts, the amount of violence. Can you just paint that picture a little bit about the different groups that are popping up in this time?
Sure. So you have the end of the SDS, which is Students for a Democratic Society, sort of coming to a close. You also have the Black Panther Party also sort of seeing its demise as well. All of this is taking place in the early 1970s. And so these are sort of, I feel like, the last gaps of breath for these militant groups that are trying to make a political point, either using force or violence or violent force to do those things. And they're all responding to the disillusion that they have against the war, to the dissatisfaction that they have with capitalism, the dissatisfaction that they have with the police state and police brutality. And so there are a lot of groups that are always sort of finding solidarity in each other as well, and their attempts to combat what they believe is hypocritical in American democracy.
Yeah, I feel like that word disillusionment is so important because you had these sustained nonviolent protests during the 1960s, and that was held up as kind of the model of how you affect political change. And you get to the late 1960s, and not only are you facing still very high levels of police violence during these protests, but you're not seeing the extent of political change that you want. The war doesn't come to an end. Racism doesn't end in America. Capitalism doesn't become any nicer. And so there's this sense that what you're going to keep doing it. And for some people, they just drop out of the movement. For some people, they move on to different kinds of issues. And for some people, they decide, we're going to have to change our tactics if we want to actually affect this kind of change.
And to really meet violence with violence.
Yeah. Yeah. And it is so interesting to look back at. I mean, we talk about the shifts in these tactics and the splintering of groups in different eras. And Kellie, it's funny because you talked about how this was the last gasps of these kinds of groups, but it was sort of the first gasps of these kinds of groups. And you realize, like, we're talking about a period here. It's like late 1969 to like early 1974, sort of. Like, it really is a short time period.
About 5-6 years, maybe
at most, before most. Stuff. So it's almost, again, it's like the last throes is both this moment where new stuff is popping up, but it is a representation of stuff splintering and fracturing. I mean, obviously it makes me think of like how long the last 3-4 years in our current lives have felt. But then, looking back on it 30, 40, 50 years later, you realize, oh, wow, that all happened in just a few years. It was moving so quickly.
Can I also just add that, like, these are young people that are participating in these things. A lot of these people are 19, 20, 21. I mean, these aren't necessarily people with families and big careers and things of that nature. And I think it goes with mentioning just the fact that these are very young people that are being radicalized and mobilized, and that I think that says something as well about the generation that is being compelled to act.
Yeah, and a reminder that a lot of these people are still very much around and alive and active, and so it makes you think about now. I mean, so many of these movements that we saw come up over the summer were pushed by the vanguard of those were very young people, and we're gonna be living. Those people are gonna go, if they survive, they're gonna go on to live long political lives and try and affect change throughout their lives. One other thing, when we talked about how this really, the galvanizing force at the heart of this was the Vietnam War movement, which is obviously an international cause in a sense, but the sort of international element of this, the solidarity with other groups around the world, I think is really worth pointing out.
Yeah, there's definitely global solidarity. I mean, if you think about the Black Panther Party, they have chapters all over the world. And so when times get hot and they're thinking about getting out of Dodge, there are places they can go in Cuba and Algeria and China. All throughout Latin America, they have other brothers and sisters, or comrades, as they would say, in arms, that are in full support of the work that they're doing in the United States and really attempting to do throughout the underdeveloped world. So it's really remarkable to me to see that this is not just something that's like a one-off in Chicago or New York. It's not just national. It's really international in terms of how people are making connections with their ideas.
Yeah, I mean, there's this sense that there is a global network of the formerly colonized people of the world. And the Weather Underground sees itself as part of that work of throwing off the empires, throwing off the colonial powers. And so they're making common cause with Laos in protest of the U.S. invasion there, the protest against the bombings in Cambodia and in Vietnam, and seeing themselves as in alliance with the people who are the subjects of U.S. violence rather than members of the empire themselves.
Let's bring it back to some of the actions by the Weather Underground itself. This bombing at the Capitol was not an isolated event, right? There was an ongoing campaign.
So this idea of bringing the war home was connected to this broader agenda of the Days of Rage. And this was going to be making the outrage and the opposition felt through a series of bombings. There were something over the course of 4 years, something like 20, 25 bombings. They were targeting not just places like the U.S. Capitol, but particular people who they saw as particularly responsible for the U.S. foreign policy. And of course, one of the consequences of all of this, these are young people making bombs, and there's a major explosion at one of their Greenwich Village houses where 3 people die because they blow themselves up. And so it was a violence that not only was being directed out, but was having some consequences for the movement itself.
Yeah, so I guess that's a good chance to talk a little bit about how the Weather Underground comes to a close, or what happens in the subsequent years. So as you said, there are actions that are successful and not successful. That leads to some splintering within the group. But one other huge factor in this is deep efforts to undermine these groups from within, what we can call COINTELPRO, counterintelligence efforts. The Weather Underground and other groups are targeted by the FBI. Law enforcement is going after them, trying to undermine them. And this is certainly something that happens to a lot of similar groups at that time.
Oh my gosh, yes. The infiltration was rampant. In some cases, you have like groups made up of larger numbers than informants than of the participants themselves. I mean, that's absurd. But the idea that a lot of COINTELPRO infiltrates these groups, sends out cross messages to create confusion or disunity. The fact that you have FBI agents suggesting plots of violence, bringing, bombs. Hey, here's a bomb. Maybe you should use it at this next rally. Like, it makes no sense that the federal government is infiltrating in this way, but they wanted to discredit these groups to show that they were, hell-bent on violence and corruption and chaos. And a lot of these groups get splintered because of COINTELPRO.
Yeah, it's so fascinating because it's a weird position for the government to be in. I mean, we talked about this a little bit with the Sarah Jane Moore episode, the person who tries to assassinate President Ford. She was an FBI informant, and she was going around to these different leftist groups, but she was also in some ways being radicalized by them, in some ways just kind of playing both sides off the other. And we see this with the Klan as well, that the FBI starts to infiltrate white power groups, and sometimes helps to plan and participate in violence. And that seems not great for the government to be doing.
The running joke was sort of like, if anyone comes to the room and they suggest violence, they're cool.
That's a cop. Yeah, I mean, it is sometimes a little ham-fisted in that way. But, we're seeing it now. I mean, there's reports, there were some reports recently that, like, some of the leaders of the Proud Boys or the 3%ers, have been informants all along. I don't think that sometimes that's a true believer is they apply pressure and they flip them as opposed to a pure plant or whatever. But I think it's also a reminder. A lot of sort of anti-gang work is this way too. Like you have to realize these are very small, intimate systems with small numbers of people, right? I mean, they feel like movements. They cause lots of terror and they do high-profile work, but it's really like we're talking about a group of 15, 20 people. And so if you get 2 or 3 of those in there and you start to break it apart and cause tensions between leadership and so forth, that is one of the ways to really infiltrate and break it down. Now, one thing I want to point out is certainly this was a story with the Black Panthers, right? I think the sort of like very concerted infiltration of the Black Panthers, and then moreover, the picking off of the Black Panthers sort of one by one in this sort of really systematic way, both jailing and killing. A little of that happened here with the Weather Underground, but not exactly, Kellie. And I think there's a sort of important difference, right?
Yeah, the double standard here, I mean, is just so remarkable when you think about the consequences of participating in these organizations. So when it came to like the Black Panthers, the demise is violent and almost always led by the violence of the state, either being jailed, imprisoned, placed in solitary confinement, killed, assassinated, as in the case of Fred Hampton. But then when you think about, the Weather Underground and what happens to these group of people that participate in violent acts, they kind of just get a slap on the wrist. I mean, a lot of the charges against them are dropped. Very few of them actually face real prison time. And so I think you have a real divide in terms of who gets to face the real punishment of the state or the brunt of state violence and who gets sort of pass. I think that's the best way to put it. Who gets a pass?
Yeah, it's a pretty stark disconnect. The Weather Underground, look, first of all, they probably, more of them died accidentally building bombs than in any sort of interaction with the state. But it also, it's treated so lightly that it becomes kind of a punchline going forward, right? You mentioned, Jody, how this very small group can loom so large in the historical narrative, but there's also like a weather website called the Weather Underground, and it seems, I don't know, seems a sign that it's been shorn of its violent content.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, that website started like a few years ago, and I saw it. I've known about the Weather Underground for a long time, and I saw it, and I was like, whoa, this feels really weird. And part of me wonders if they just didn't even know about the Weather Underground, or I don't know. But yeah, but to that point, Niki, I mean, and as we start to wrap up, I'm curious, like, is the Weather Underground something that is still a touchstone in conservative circles? Is it still something that pops up? I mean, like Saul Alinsky is the forever boogeyman, right, for right-wing radio, and that's the sort of loosely in this world. Does the Weather Underground come up at all, as you
Jody.
can see?
Barack Obama was friends with a man called Bill Ayers, who was a leader of the Weather Underground. And I don't think you could have tuned into a single conservative talk radio show or Fox News during the Obama administration and not heard some mention of Bill Ayers. So I would say a hearty yes to the presence of the Weather Underground in right-wing rhetoric these days.
Okay, well, let's leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Follow us on social media at This Day Pod on Twitter and Instagram. You can find all sorts of fun stuff there. Leave a rating and a review in your favorite podcast app. That really helps. And more importantly, get in touch. If you have any questions or comments about the show, email us thisdaypod@gmail.com. My name is Jody Avergan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
At 1 minute before 1 o'clock this morning, the switchboard at the Capitol received a phone call. A man's voice said a bomb would go off in the building in half an hour. At 1:30 in the morning, it did, in a small, unmarked restroom on the ground floor of the Senate side, next to a barber shop and near several small offices, including one committee hearing room.